Hello, so my name's George Gilbert. I'm a lecturer in modern Russian history at the University of Southampton, and today I'm going to speak to you about the Russian Revolution. So where to begin then? So I'm going to just kind of quickly show to you then on this slide number 2 a poem, and the poem's called The Springtime of Freedom. The question mark, because you might want to think about whether this was in fact a springtime for freedom for the Russian people, 1917. So you can see here this, I think, quite interesting poem. And you might want to note that it was published in a loyal newspaper, Izvestia, that means news. And it was published by Stepan Stepanov, a Navy seaman. So I think this is an interesting example here of what you might call, maybe slightly hesitantly, working class culture in Russia in 1917. And it's how Navy seaman is experiencing the revolution, what they kind of feel about what the revolution means. And you can see they see it as kind of like a dawn. They're talking about oppression being broken. The people were clearly bound in chains. That's a reference, of course, to the previous political system of Tsarism. And he's talking about kind of fruit being brought forth. So he's talking about kind of a positive transition away from an autocratic system into a time of freedom. And you can see here, just from this kind of brief snippet from this poem, it's not the full poem, it's just one stanza, one verse. But there isn't actually here any reference to communism, any reference to socialism. It's all about freedom, and it's all about the possibility that revolution can bring for people. And very interestingly, when you look at the sources from the period, and you look at the sources, as we would say, from below, from people involved in the revolution on the ground, workers, soldiers, sailors and others, peasants, men and women, young and old, a lot of these sources talk about freedom, they talk about liberation. They don't talk about the revolution as in the kind of the political frame that we might expect, communism or Russian socialism. So I just want to kind of give really quick to you a few kind of brief kind of snippets of how we can think about revolution in this kind of taster lecture. And the PowerPoint's quite detailed. You're welcome to follow it through in more depth by yourself. And I'm going to rip through some of the points at quite a brief pace in order to fit the time. So I want to talk to you a little bit about events, and I want to talk to you a bit about interpretations. And those are kind of the two poles, really, this short lecture is going to kind of work around. So thinking about events first then. So I do want to just mention a little bit about World War I, because of course that's what immediately precedes the revolution. I want to talk a bit about 1917 itself, as you might expect, and then a little bit about the civil war that follows in Russia. And then I also want to, at the end of this lecture, think a bit about where the revolution sort of stands today, kind of what do we mean by Russian Revolution, really, and how have, not just us, but how have maybe people elsewhere in the world seen and experienced the revolution today, but also in history. What do people in Russia think about the revolution, we might ask ourselves. Thinking about events then, so I'm kind of taking the revolution sort of through 7 years, war, revolution, civil war. It's quite fashionable in scholarship now, and has been for some time, to periodise the revolution, to conceptualise it not just as a kind of a single year, but as a kind of a longer term process. This is something that I think became very popular after Peter Holquest's book Russia in Revolution, Continuum of Crisis, where he wrote about this kind of period from war to revolution as kind of a continuum, and he kind of drew parallels rather than thinking about them discretely as separate events. Now, in historiography, the historical writing of the revolution, you might compare and contrast this approach with, say, the approach of, off the top of my head, someone like Alexander Rabinovich, who wrote a book, The Bolsheviks Come to Power, that's very much a fine-grained analysis of 1917 itself. There's different ways of thinking about revolution, and it does depend on your perspective and where you stand. I think plausible arguments can be made for either a synoptic view of revolution, a view over time, or a kind of the depth study, revolution as kind of months or even days maybe. Both are very, very plausible. Both can give you different perspectives. Both have, I think, strengths as approaches. Thinking first then about World War I then, so the war years of 1914-17, of course, were hugely transformational in Russia, as indeed they were in other countries. And you might want to think about how World War I at one point was very much the kind of forgotten about period in Russia itself, in the historical writing of Russia. It's become much more back into focus in the last sort of decade or so, when many people in Russia itself are writing increasingly about World War One and about questions like why Russia became involved in the First World War, how did World War One transform Russian society, and where does World War One fit into this longer term kind of continuum of revolution. There isn't enough time to go into about it in much depth today, but just to add to that as a caveat, you can see much longer term causes throughout the 19th century into the early 20th. You can think of the revolution going way back into the 19th century, looking at things like the development of a working class opposition, the workers' question, or the rise of peasant political consciousness, for example, all as themes contributing to revolution, but not the only ones by any means. What's very clear, and I'll provide this sort of bit of detail in this brief survey, is that war had enormous social impact after its declaration in 1914. That's true indeed in Russia, is indeed of all of the major belligerents involved. We see full-scale mobilisation, the rail network was very stretched, there's huge population movements, and some historians such as Peter Gattrell and others have written very eloquently about the refugee crisis we saw on the Eastern Front in 1914. We see a shift from consumer goods to heavy industry, which led to inflation. Full-scale mobilisation placed enormous pressures on the population at large. It curtailed agricultural production, which led to the worsening condition of the Russian peasantry, which was already in quite a parlous state. It leads to a wide social crisis, and it also creates enormous shifts in gender relations in terms of what's seen as kind of male and female labour. We might then think of that ground level or kind of bottom-up perspective and contrast it with the role of those at the top. So, of course, the Tsar Nicholas II is a seminal figure here. He appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Army in August 1915. This proves to be a huge mistake as it ties himself to failures in war effort. And meanwhile, he leaves the Tsarina, his wife Alexandra, in charge as he's away on the home front. In 1917, of course, he abdicates. The war is not generally a happy experience, it should be said, for Nicholas II. As he is away on the military front, the home front starts to suffer from stories of kind of treason, fantasies of kind of end of empire, kind of stories of what the Tsar's court was up to. One of the very obvious examples I'll just kind of very briefly mention is kind of Rasputin, the kind of the so-called mad monk, came from Siberia, said to have a kind of a negative influence at the imperial court. So here you can see on slide number 8 an example of the anti-Rasputin propaganda that circulated in Russia during the war years. These kind of very febrile fantasies of kind of treason, of kind of German or kind of foreign, more widely mendacious influence in the court do circulate in Russia quite a lot, really, in 1914, 15, 16, up until the collapse. I don't think they're the causal factor of why the revolution comes about, but they're an interesting thing to, I think, ruminate on. Looking at the war more widely, enormous problems with the home front, the crisis of grain, the crisis of feeding the people, lead to a resurgence in strike movement in late 1915 and in 1916. When February 1917 starts in Petrograd, what was then renamed as Petrograd from St. Petersburg, these large demonstrations, as you can see this image here, these are nothing new. These have been going on for some time, but there's a broader groundswell of opposition, I think it's fair to say, to Tsarism for some time, and that of course spills over into 1917 itself following the Tsar's abdication. For a long time, historians have looked at the military front and the collapse in the military as being key causal factors in why 1917 comes about. And it's very important to realise that, of course, military crisis did play an enormous role in this shift towards revolution. But also the home front, I think, illustrates to us very well that there was great popular dissatisfaction with the course of the war. You can see here on the banner in Cyrillic, this translates into English as an increased ration to the families of soldiers, those who defend the motherland and the people's peace. That's on the front of those two banners. The banner, which is slightly back in the crowd, reads Feed the Children, the Defenders of the Motherland, the Rodina. So these two banners really here kind of demonstrate, I think, popular calls for change. And this is in Petrograd, of course, Russia's imperial capital. The next slide is also an image from 1917, which is of soldiers demonstrating during this month. So you can see here in these enormous kind of groups of people, great popular demands for change. The scale of the crowds is worth noting, and also its diversity. We have soldiers on the one hand, but also we've got on the other women and children, you can see in the slide before. 1917 itself is of course a year of great change. It's a very, very complicated year. I won't go into all of the detail regarding this year, but I think it's very important I kind of just sketch to you briefly some of the main things you might want to take away from this, which is the renaissance of kind of working class militancy in 1917, which you can track through the appearance of the Soviets, workers' councils, which developed enormously during this year, and also the revival of the trade union movement, which saw 2 million members by October in 1917. There's an interesting kind of interpretation of how people saw the Soviets. Some consider them to be organs of revolutionary democracy. Others maybe saw them as being perhaps something a little bit different, but popular calls for freedom and change were understood in a variety of ways during 1917, and I think when you look at the sources from the period, the contingency is well worth thinking about. Dual power was of course the political settlement for much of the year between the two revolutions in February, March, October, November. Provisional government headed by Prince Georgy Lvov. A provisional government that was of course born into very uneasy circumstances, born into war, which of course did not end when the Tsar abdicated. The war was continuing. Even so, we can see political changes being promised. On the 2nd of March 1917, the government pledged a programme of far-reaching civil and political rights and a decision to convoke a constituent assembly. Meanwhile, we've got the Petrograd Soviet, the largest of the Soviets on the other hand, of being very key in this year. This controls the army, transport, communications. 1,200 deputies were elected to this body within the first few months of its creation. Interestingly, not many personnel switch between the two, the Soviet on the one hand and the provisional government on the other. Alexander Kerensky is the only deputy from the Petrograd Soviet who ever joins the provisional government. Now, I haven't mentioned the Bolsheviks yet. Of course, Lenin's a key figure in this year. Lenin, of course, starts all of this in exile, but he sees an opportunity. There's lots of problems, of course, in Russia at this time. The war's still ongoing after February 1917. There are frequent ministerial changes in the provisional government throughout the year, and peasant land hunger, which had been a long-term issue, and you can, of course, relate to those wartime crises, is still a huge problem. And there's much impatience in Russia itself. It's at this period in early 1917, in April, in fact, that Lenin returns after 16 long years in exile. Lenin has, I think, a different view on the urgency of revolutionary transformation as he might see it to many of his peers. He calls for an end to what he terms revolutionary defensism, an immediate end to the imperialist war, an attitude and a view that was not held universally amongst the Bolsheviks, it should be said, who he represented. And he sees an opportunity for insurrection. One of the most famous examples of this in 1917 is on July, when we see the July Days. Troops from the Kronstadt naval base and the Bolshevik activists are fired upon by troops loyal to the government. This insurrection is indeed quashed by Alexander Kerensky, and he orders severe retribution against those involved in the rising. At this stage, it looks like Lenin might have lost. Kerensky has seemed to have crushed Lenin, who flees back to his exile of Finland. However, the provisional government is still beset by problems. We have, following in July, the appointment of L.G. Kornilov as Commander-in-Chief of the Russian Army, an appointment designed to save Russia from anarchy and show Kerensky as a strong leader. And this seems to create a kind of a separate and a new power struggle between, on the one hand, General Kornilov, and on the other, Alexander Kerensky. On the 26th of August of 1917, Kerensky lashes out after receiving an ultimatum asking that military and civil authority be placed in the hands of a supreme commander. This is something that's known as the Kornilov affair. Kerensky accuses General Kornilov of conspiring to overthrow the government. Kornilov is relieved of his duties but appears to ignore Kerensky's commands and advances on Petrograd, and there is dispute in scholarship about whether Kornilov was conspiring to overthrow the government or not. In a somewhat humiliating kind of move, Kerensky needs to call on the Soviets, who control a lot of the industry and a lot of the kind of geographical kind of sense of importance in Petrograd, to stop General Kornilov. Now, this leads into what's very, very well known as the Bolshevik, you could call it a coup, in the later part of the year. Got here an image of Lenin in disguise upon his illegal return to Russia. On the 31st of August, the Petrograd Soviet passes the Bolshevik Revolution on power. The Soviets call for transfer of all power to the Soviets, a call that is widely misunderstood. Many workers understand this as an end to what they called as bourgeois provisional government. And we see Bolshevik slogans of peace, bread and land becoming very, very important at this time. Lenin is convinced the time is right. He returns from Finland. And on early November, Lenin persuades the Bolshevik Central Committee to commit to the overthrow of the provisional government, and this leads into the kind of the revolution of later in the year, the one that actually does lead to the transfer of power away from the provisional government into kind of what would become Soviet socialism. So we have splits in the Bolshevik Party. Kamenev and Zinoviev oppose Lenin's action. On the 9th of October, things start to move quite rapidly with the creation of a military revolutionary committee, the MRC, to resist the transfer of power, an organisation Trotsky, one of Lenin's allies, later uses to unseat the government. And Kerensky becomes wise to what's going on, and later in October moves against the Bolshevik printing press, which gives Trotsky a pretext to strike back. Leading into the revolution itself, one thing that's very interesting to reflect upon is that this transfer of power comes very swiftly and very suddenly. If you contrast it with, say, the February Revolution, where you've got enormous numbers of people involved in this transfer of power, in the fall of the Tsar and the abdication, the unrest at home, the unrest on the military front, actually the political transfer that comes in October, November is committed by very small numbers of people and very, very tightly organised, and it occurs over a very short period of time. It's really only in 5 or 6 days, really, in Petrograd itself that power actually transfers. On the 24th of October, military units of Red Guards take control of vital strategic points, and on the 25th of October, Lenin appears in public for the first time since the July days to proclaim that the provisional government had been overthrown. On the same day, the Second Congress of Soviets opens, and this is something that looks like then that a revolution has been achieved. Menschfix and the Socialist Revolutionaries, the other socialists in Russia at the time, apart from the Bolsheviks, the main ones I should say, denounced this insurrection, and this gives Trotsky his kind of chance to kind of throw out there his famous quip. Throughout 1917, you might think then, why did the Bolsheviks come to power? Why not the Socialist Revolutionaries? Why not the Menschfix, for example? It's a very complicated question. One thing I think that's clear from looking at the sources at the time is the Bolsheviks prove adept at sloganeering people's popular concerns. That's not to say other parties don't have their successes, but there's great opportunism within the Bolshevik ranks. For instance, looking at the famous April theses, Peace, Bread, Land for Lenin, that proves popular. It really is a kind of a cut and paste of the Socialist Revolutionary Party's kind of ideas from much earlier. They're not always wholly original, but they do know when to strike politically. They're quite good at political tactics. So, just want to kind of briefly then, before moving on to the next bit for the chronology, to consider about why this revolution actually occurs. Well, I think it's fair to say that there were opportunities for moderation during 1917 that were missed. And the provisional government, as I mentioned some moments ago, didn't really have a particularly easy birth period. The provisional government lacked legitimacy, and it was beset by a series of crises across the entire country. It's very interesting to think at the time when you look at the sources about these different ideas of democracy and how they vary. Democracy is a really key word in 1917 itself. We see from many different types of people in different parts of the Russian Empire, and then later on what becomes Soviet Russia and the Soviet Union. Debate and contestation about what democracy actually means. A socialised conception of democracy, a desire for revolutionary change, vies for a liberal conception based around private property. And there is discrepancy, it should be noted, on the Bolshevik if you like, support base. Something that some key historians, such as here I quote Steve Smith, see as being really key, is the decision to continue the war once the provisional government comes to power. Some think that the fate of democracy, the fate of an alternative, was sealed by this decision to continue the war in 1917. Now, of course, 1917 itself is not the end point of transformational changes in Russia. It, of course, leads into a much longer period, in fact, of civil war from 1917 into the 1920s. The Bolsheviks seek an immediate end to the war. The peace that followed in Brest-Litovsk in 1918 was very punitive. But they inherit a Russia full of crisis. Demographic crisis of population decrease, famine, disease and starvation are all incredibly strong, very keenly felt in Russia. There's enormous human costs to this political story. Now, whilst the transfer of power in Petrograd itself comes very quickly, the establishment of Soviet power in the countryside is a much more difficult matter entirely, and it's something that occurs over a long period of time. And there is indeed, as we see in the Civil War, great resistance to Bolshevik rule across enormous parts of Russia. You might here see on slide 23 a map showing Russian front movements in the Civil War in the West in 1918, and you can see here under Bolshevik rule until February 1918, very central in Russia, Petersburg, Moscow, but also other important centres like Smolensk and Penza and Saratov. But in enormous parts of the former Russian Empire, places like Kiev, Yekaterinoslav, Kharkov and others, we can see that the Bolshevik, anti-Bolshevik forces I should say, do have an enormous advance. There's enormous change and flux in this period, and there's great unrest and great resistance to Bolshevism across enormous parts of Russia. We see this in 1918, the Kornilov movement. There's of course the important story of foreign intervention, the Czech Legion in 1918. The Civil War, like many fratricidal conflicts tend to be, is incredibly brutal, and it compounds these existing economic, social and political crises that are facing Russia, worsening them in many respects. This conflict between Reds and Whites leads to millions of casualties. And historians hotly debate the reasons about why the Reds actually win, though many concur that they possessed important strategic advantages. Also important ideological advantages, I would suggest. There's more unity, I think, with the Reds than there are with the Whites, I should say, at various points. Now, Peter Holquist is one of several scholars who've looked at the violence of the period, an epoch of violence, he calls it. And it's a very important period, I believe, for transforming the Bolshevik Party itself. During the Civil War, the Bolshevik Party expands hugely in terms of party membership and in terms of its reach in terms of state power. We see very famously the establishment of Cheka in December 1917, in early 1918, the dissolution of Constituent Assembly. The creation, according to some scholars, of the Bolshevik dictatorship occurs in these early years of the Civil War. Historians disagree about when the exact end point of the Civil War actually occurred. Many suggest 1921 to 22 as a key date. And you can see here an example on the right, on slide number 25, red propaganda aimed at peasants, for example. Peasants and workers, I should say. You might want to contrast that with the white propaganda that we saw several slides ago, which reads at the top, for a united Russia, with a kind of the white knight slaying the red dragon. So really the Civil War rages well into the 1920s. By 1920 to 21, I think it's clear that the Bolsheviks are going to win at some point, that the Reds will win the Civil War. But it's certainly not something that many of the leaders took for granted in that period and indeed in earlier. It was a very uneasy creation, the Soviet Union, and that colours, of course, its politics in the years to come in all sorts of very dramatic and indeed contested ways. So what I really want to do then, in the second part of this lecture, is quite briefly reflect on some of the aspects of what revolution means and kind of maybe why we should even study or think about this event. Now, my own view is that we can't really understand the 20th century properly without really appreciating the story of its greatest revolution, and a revolution that sets the scene for many that come later on. Of course, it fits the yardstick of what a revolution is in virtually every respect: transfer of power, the creation of a new regime, the creation of new traditions of insurgency and protest, and also the establishment of a new order. There's many different ways you can read into this, I think. The provisional government, of course, were brought to the stage very reluctantly as revolutionaries. The Tsar was overthrown in an act of desperation to bring about victory in war. But below we see competing voices. Many of the masses want social revolution, they want total change. And this is something that becomes a very important story of 1917 itself. And I think it also leads us into important things to reflect upon in Russian history in this period earlier, and indeed what's to come later on. The reform of the autocracy, could it be achieved? Obviously, eventually it wasn't, but we might think of possibilities there. The continuing importance of leadership and rule, the management of borders, and so much recent scholarship, I think, has focused very well on the fact this is a truly empire-wide story of power transition. It's not something that just affects Petrograd and Moscow, but it's something that affects enormous quantities of territory across vast landmass with many different diverse types of people, diverse national, social, ethnic, gender identities. And that, of course, leads into very important ways in which these people experience conflict and war. In the longer term, I think, you can also see the influence here of ideas in Russia, Marxism, of course, being a key one, but also things like socialism more broadly, and also anarchism have a very important role to play in this story. Now, as historians, we can, of course, think about the revolution in many different ways, and we're aided greatly by an enormous and, in many respects, very high-quality historiography. By that, I mean a body of historical writing about the revolution specifically. Historians, of course, debate the long-term, short-term causes. They debate the main events, cultural, social and political. They debate the influence of revolution in Russia itself, and also, of course, outside of Russia. It's got an enormous global remit, and that's something we see at the time, and it's something that lasts in years to come. You can also think in terms of the revolution as a chronology, and this is something I mentioned at the start of my talk, but you might look at 1917 itself, or if we do want to broaden its chronology, where do we start, where do we end our period of study? Some might say in 1905 revolution into the Civil War, some might look even more widely at the late 19th century into the late 1920s, or some might look into the Stalinist 1930s, as Sheila Fitzpatrick does in her very well-known study of the Russian Revolution. Of course, in the Soviet Union, it was the foundational event of that country that was around for 70 plus years, and it's got enormous significance in terms of the world. You can see here on slide number 32, revolution in China in 1949, of course, was in many respects very much inspired by what was going on in Russia. Now, at one stage in the 20th century, communist states had enormous importance, and they at one stage had what contained within them 1/3 of the world's population. That's, of course, been whittled down now to 5 really truly communist states. But of course, it's not just the question of these most obvious political formations. You can also look in many respects at the impact on non-communist countries of the Russian Revolution. Even in democracies like Britain and like in America, it's got an enormous significance. And not just in terms of the enemy other, but also in terms of left-wing movements in those countries that might look to the revolution for inspiration. Many of them did in the 1920s and 1930s, like it might seem strange to us now, and indeed in later years some of those trends continue. In Russia itself, very recently, of course, there was a commemorative opportunity that was not fully grasped, and that was the centenary of the revolution in 1917. Putin's really stance on this as leader was really to, in his view, kind of leave discussion of the revolution to the experts, to show that it had occurred and to acknowledge it had occurred, not to really mark it that much. Of course, there's an ideological problem because revolution invites discussion of regime change. But there's also a problem of its legacy. It isn't really the clear kind of foundational event for what Russia is about now, after 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. There isn't really a clear legacy for the current regime to inherit in that sense. So talking about revolution per se, very difficult. Talking about 1917 specifically, also quite tricky, I think, for the Russian state. If we think of it from our perspective, then we might think, to kind of paraphrase Monty Python, look them up if you've never heard of them, what has the Russian Revolution ever done for us? We've got the defeat of Nazism in World War II. Some might argue that maybe if Russia had not strengthened in the 1930s, that wouldn't have been achieved in the speed it did or at the rate it was. Seems like quite a perverse argument considering the enormous consequences and costs of Stalinism, but I think it is something we could consider in terms of Russia's industrial development. Of course, Russia played an enormous role in waging the conflict in World War II. Russia's been a great laboratory of ideas for the 20th century, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's also been for many, in Russia and indeed abroad, a model for revolution. There's a lot more one could say about that in terms of the legacy of the revolution, but I will at this point just kind of draw a few threads together briefly, just by way of conclusion. Hopefully it's kind of whetted your appetite to find out a little bit more about this very interesting kind of historical event. I think it's very important to realise, when you look at the sources from the time, that there are many different opportunities and possibilities available to Russia's rulers. And by that I mean Tsar Nicholas II and his advisors before 1917. I mean the provisional government for much of 1917 itself, but also alternatives in the Socialist wing during 1917 and after, and indeed alternatives in the running of the Bolshevik party specifically. The revolution as it occurred was not an inevitability. There are things that I think made it more likely, but it was never something I think was destined to happen. It's something that was brought about by discrete historical events, processes, and indeed opportunities that were grasped by various people, or indeed opportunities that were missed by some. Rulers and opposition forces were both faced with great choices then. Thinking about it structurally, Russia was modernising, its economy was developing, it was transforming, it was shifting, but it was modernising at an unstable and piecemeal fashion and at a kind of a strange rate, I think, as we might see it in the West from our vantage point. Political and social developments were not in step with one another, as Russia modernised greatly from the end of the 19th century under ministers of finance like Sergei Witta, followed very coherent policies to modernise and develop the country's infrastructure. But these political and social developments didn't really develop alongside the economic ones. Russia's society, civic society and civic mindedness were developing in the late 19th century and early 20th, but it was indeed enormous backwardness in many respects, and indeed the political situation doesn't change too much fundamentally. When there is great change, like of course in 1905, there's the convocation of the October Manifesto, those opportunities for change afterwards are not always fully grasped. A very important event, of course, looking up to 1917 itself and beyond, is thinking about the war of 1914-17. Did the war cause the revolution is a very key point in historical literature. Some might say you've got to look at it longer term and think, well, actually, without the war, you might have had a revolution at some stage anyway, a great historical what if. But some would look very specifically at the war, what occurs and how it catalyses and indeed radicalises existing political problems in Russia. So I think then hopefully that brief survey has given you much food for thought to think about in terms of revolution in Russia and about some of the kind of the broader ramifications that you can take away. Of course, all of those areas you might go into in much more depth, but I think it's a very interesting period of history. It's something that I think can affect our understanding of history more widely, and indeed something that I think does affect our reading of the 20th century itself much more broadly. Not just about the development of Russia and the Soviet Union, but also the development of world history and the global history more widely. I think there are certain processes and events in that cannot only be truly understood meaningfully with reference to the Russian Revolution of 1917. And at that point, I will conclude the lecture. I hope you have enjoyed this, and of course, I would encourage you to find out more. There's a great historiography available on the Revolution that you may wish to engage with quite fully.